Good afternoon. I'm Lindsay Reiser. We have been watching the confirmation hearing for Attorney General nominee Todd Blanche. Of course, Blanche was the personal attorney for President Trump for some of his criminal indictments. He has been acting Attorney General after Pam Bondi left that position. And we know that there is still a potentially uphill battle for him on Capitol Hill, with many lawmakers questioning him about recent fatal shootings involving ICE agents, lingering concerns over the handling of the Epstein files, as well as this so-called anti-weaponization fund that the DOJ entered into as part of a settlement between the IRS and President Trump. Now, Blanche has said that the fund itself, they will not be continuing with it, but there are lingering questions over the immunity part of this deal and whether this means that the president and his family members cannot be sued in the future by the IRS for any kind of tax-related litigation. And we also know that Pam Bondi herself, as she was outgoing AG, had basically laid the blame on Todd Blanche as to why there were so many redactions and so many documents that were missing from the Epstein files release. We know that millions, in fact, have been released, but there are still millions that need to be. Let's go ahead and listen to some of what Blanche had said about that.
So the review of materials included non-responsive materials. The reviewers were qualified, experienced attorneys within the department and the FBI. They took pains to apply appropriate redactions. There were mistakes that were made, and so approximately 1% of the redactions had to be fixed after we released the Epstein files. Chairman, we had dozens of lawyers on call 24/7 whenever we learned that any victim's name had been improperly not redacted. We immediately took the document down and fixed it as soon as we could. That doesn't excuse the mistakes of which I take responsibility, but it does mean that we tried to fix them. We complied with the act. It required us complying with judges' rules in New York, which required us to redact certain victims' names, even if the victim was also somebody who participated in criminal conduct.
Let's bring in CBS News Senior Justice Department reporter Sarah Lynch now. So, Sarah, obviously CBS News has been all over this reporting. 6 million Epstein files, 3 million have been released. Of course, the DOJ telling CBS News it's released every document required by the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Is what Blanche said today about how that all went down, did that appear to be satisfactory to the majority of the body?
You know, when it comes to the handling of the files, I think there's a little bit more understanding there. It was a tricky rollout. They had multiple different divisions and offices within DOJ reviewing all of these. We had people in the FBI, we had people in the Southern District of New York, the criminal division. And there were mistakes, and that is, you know, unfortunate. And Blanche has repeatedly apologized and acknowledged that mistakes were made. And, you know, every time they caught one, they try to go back and fix it. I think the bigger issue and the lingering question is more about whether, you know, all the victims will be able to meet with him. And that was something that was many people hammered on today. There are a number of victims that say they haven't been able to get a meeting with Blanche. He told senators today that if they're represented by counsel, there are rules that sort of limit whether or not he will be able to do that. He has offered to have other people at DOJ meet with those individuals, including their new coordinator on human trafficking.
What else did we hear in terms of this anti-weaponization fund that we know that Blanche has said they're not moving forward on, but many questions still remain about the immunity part of that settlement?
Yes, so there's two parts to the settlement. One is the weaponization fund, which he repeatedly said today is dead in the water. It is not coming back, although he did acknowledge there's a chance down the road President Trump could try to challenge them on breaching the agreement, although he doesn't think that's going to happen at this point. But the other controversial aspect of this is the fact that Mr. Trump and his family and his companies were basically granted immunity from any sort of audits or criminal investigations arising from prior tax years. Now, what Todd Blanche said today is that that is only applicable to years past, but not going forward. So in the future, anytime tax returns are now filed, those are not subject to that agreement, and that could be, those could be audited or investigated if it came to that.
Let's go ahead and listen to some of Blanche in his own words on this topic.
As part of the settlement between the IRS and President Trump and some of his family, 2 of his sons and his organization, as is typical when there's a settlement between plaintiffs and the IRS, part of the settlement included release of any past audits. It does not give any protection to the president, his family, or his organizations for any taxes they file. If they filed it the day of that I signed that agreement, or the day after, they have no protection.
No matter what their liability, no matter what their violation of tax law, you signed a document that forever discharged them from any legal responsibility.
As part of the settlement that we entered into, any past audits were
How often do you think that's been done in the history of the United States?
involving the President of the United States. I'm not sure it's ever been done, but this type of settlement is done regularly.
So you're saying that when it comes to the President of the United States, his family and businesses have no responsibility under the tax laws for any wrongdoing prior to the signing of this document?
No, I mean, I didn't say that at all. What I'm saying is that I think President Trump and his family are the first president that had their tax returns illegally taken, and made available to the public. So that is unique to President Trump, yes. But this type of settlement is not unique to the Department of Justice or the IRS.
So there we have, it's pretty clear that it wasn't satisfactory to all lawmakers that just because this doesn't include any taxes that he may file after that agreement was signed, it still isn't up to snuff for them, that this completely renders the president, his businesses, and his family members immune from audits for prior tax returns. Correct.
So there's nothing that going forward, he's not immune, but the fact that he would be able to, not have any of his prior tax years ever looked at again, I think is concerning to Democrats who sit on the Judiciary Committee and in the Senate more broadly.
And some Republicans as well. I want to ask you what else stood out to you in this hearing, because there were some notable exchanges on, for example, January 6 convictions, tossing out those convictions for most of the offenders. What else stood out to you in terms of what we heard from lawmakers and from hoping to be permanent AG Blanche?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think that it was pretty cordial, all things considered. I mean, there have been some very fiery hearings over the past year, particularly with former Attorney General Pam Bondi, who often evaded questions and resorted to hurling insults. And she seemed to have one prepared for every single member of the panel then. And in this case, I think it was a lot more cordial than maybe people anticipated. There were tough questions, but there was a lot of respect. There were a couple moments, I think, where there were people quipped at one another, especially when questions came up related to FBI Director Kash Patel. He was asked about whether, he was concerned about allegations of drinking. Blanche stood by the FBI director, dismissed those concerns and questions, saying he has not seen evidence of a problem. So there were a couple heated exchanges, but for the most part, I think everybody was very professional. And Todd Blanche was very careful and circumspect in responding to questions, particularly about any open, active investigations, and managed to sort of avoid discussing some of the more controversial cases, such as the Comey indictment related to the picture of the seashells that he posted on Instagram. I mean, he was really, I think, very careful, and it seemingly went pretty smoothly for him. And at the end of the hearing, Senator Grassley congratulated him for how well it went. So all things considered, it was smooth sailing.
Cordial and smooth, but also there was sort of a slip that we've seen play out quite a bit on social media, in which Senator Kennedy from Louisiana had asked whether he and President Trump are friends, and Blanche had responded, "I'm his lawyer. I was his lawyer. Now his attorney general." There's still that perception that this body, the Department of Justice, that normally has been and should be completely independent of the White House, currently has been politicized. So in terms of the questioning, in terms of some of the reception of his answers, Did that seem to be a bipartisan concern, or does it still seem to be pretty split among the parties?
That is a good point. There was a tiny slip there where he made it sound like he still represents President Trump. And of course, that is the overarching concern by Democrats, not so much Republicans, but essentially the idea that, you know, once you become the Attorney General, you are the lawyer for the government, for the people. You are not the personal attorney of the president. And that is a overarching concern, I think, in most of the questions from Democrats today. This idea that he is carrying out the president's agenda to go after political enemies, Letitia James, James Comey, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And that is sort of, I think, the driving concern overall. And that also, of course, involves the IRS settlement, because here he is officially signing this agreement as Attorney General when he really recently represented President Trump in his personal capacity. Now, Blanche, I think, sought to distance himself a little bit in that regard, and he acknowledged, of course, signing it, but he said he didn't draft that agreement. And he also spoke at a couple instances about recusals and about how whenever it was required of him by ethics rules, he did recuse himself. But I think that is the overarching theme that drives many of the concerns by Democrats on the committee, this idea that he has not separated his representation of the president versus his new role as acting Attorney General, that they're still one and the same.
Sarah Lynch, thank you.